All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Reese Norman. I am the CEO of NeuroGlow, and with us today is Trevor Bishop. He's our licensed professional counselor and has his own practice and works with us here at NeuroGlow, offering all of his services throughout that journey that our clients take when they're going through ketamine infusions. Trevor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. To see everybody again that might be tuning in.
Yeah. And so I think when we were thinking about content and the best way to kick off um, you know, some useful information for our patients and members of our Thrive program, you had a great idea, which was talking about, once you have gone through this series of infusions, how do we continue that journey and continue in that kind of positive notion? And so we're excited to have you today, and yeah, would love to have you take it from here, man.
Awesome. Well, I guess just to give anybody that isn't familiar with me already a really quick background on myself. I'm actually originally from Washington State. Back there, they call my job a licensed mental health counselor, but here in Texas, I'm a licensed professional counselor. I've been in practice now for about 7 years. I've been working with ketamine for a little over the half of that, about 4 years now. Kind of had my start back in Washington now as the director of ketamine assisted psychotherapy for just about 2 years. At this point in time, I'm seeing about 350 patients or so, and right now I'm involved with a few different kind of national and regional groups, the ASKP3 being a national one, and then I'm also the president and co-founder of the Professional Psychedelic Providers Association, which is kind of over the West Coast. But anyway, today I'm coming to you kind of speaking from my practice, which is Psych Therapy, that's in partnership with NeuroGlow. And I'm going to be diving into a few different kind of tips and tricks for kind of how to get the most out of your series after it finishes up. I'll be touching on a few ideas that are kind of relevant and maybe useful for those that are still in the midst of their series, trying to integrate these ketamine infusions. And also touching a little bit on kind of how do we move after the series is done and make sure that results are sustainable over a long period of time. But I'll just go ahead and jump right in if I can get things to move. I like to kind of start out with a little bit of a quote. Abraham Maslow, many of you probably know him from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but he has a really great quote about peak experiences. And he says that peak experiences often have consequences. They can have very, very important consequences, and that peak experiences can make life worthwhile by their occasional occurrence. And I like to use this quote when talking about ketamine infusions, because ketamine infusions certainly can be peak experiences. I think part of our work is what are the consequences and how do we work with it and how do we make life worthwhile moving forward after our ketamine series. When it comes to integrating psychedelic experiences, I really kind of see it as two big components. And I'll be kind of diving into each of these separately today. The first of which is integration. When I say integration, what I mean is what can we learn from the psychedelic experiences? What do they tell us about ourselves? Kind of when we follow our unconscious mind wandering around, how is that useful? And how can we actually use that to enhance our quality of life moving forward? The second category being more sustainability. What can we do to reduce the likelihood of symptoms coming back? Statistically, it's more likely than not that you will have a positive outcome from your ketamine infusion series. Let's talk about how to make sure it stays that way. You have to come back to the infusion clinic. I think all of our hopes and dreams are that you can spend your time and money with family doing the things that you love most, rather than spending that at the clinic. But we'll be kind of diving into a little bit of how do we make it stick around longer. So I guess to get us started off, some of these ideas, if you've worked with me in therapy before, you may have heard them come up, but I figure kind of doing a brief overview might be helpful and useful for us. These are really ideas related to how do we integrate psychedelic experiences. I call these lenses, and they're essentially ways to reflect on our psychedelic experience in a way that allows us to glean unique types of information that might be useful for us moving forward. One of my favorite lenses, I call it the director's chair. A little bit of setup here, but the short version is that typically, as we are right now, going through day-to-day life, we typically have an internal awareness, internal dialogue. We're kind of taking in all of our sensations and perceptions, and we use all that information collectively to interact with the external world. This is a little bit different than for a ketamine infusion, because in a ketamine infusion, we still have that internal dialogue. We still have those internal sensations and perceptions. But one key difference is that everything we're experiencing external to ourselves is being generated by our own mind. And so although we went through it initially from a main character or a first person perspective, it might be interesting to reflect on things from a third person perspective. I like to call this like the director's chair. And with this in mind, it kind of naturally leads to questions about, well, what did my character, the character of me, go through? Was I equipped for these challenges that may have come up? What kind of emotions came up for me initially? What kind of strengths helped me through that process? This all really kind of just ties on the idea of looking at ourselves from a third person perspective and how does that change things? When we look at our life, when we look at these infusions, looking at it from a different angle can often lead to different results and different kind of observations. And this director's chair lens is one of the ways in which we can do that. Down there at the bottom, Robin Carhart Harris, who is a lead researcher over at Imperial College London, he has some really interesting insights. And I really like this quote as it relates to the director's chair. He talks about how psychedelics, they seem to reveal things within one's psyche that are important and linked to why we are suffering. And they bring those things to the fore. Perhaps by looking at our infusions from the director's chair, we can start to view some of those things, start to have a greater understanding of ourselves in ways that we might overcome some of these challenges and things that are linked to why we are suffering.
Trevor, would you say, because this was my personal experience, but do you often see as patients go through their series of infusions that that maybe some of these epiphanies or some of these things that come front of mind, it may not be immediately during the infusion, right? It could be in the days,
Exactly.
weeks following that, right?
Exactly. And I think, it's kind of like the director's chair, the one that we're looking at right now. That's going to be a way to kind of get closer to one of those epiphanies. I think sometimes we read about ketamine infusions online and you can read the highlight reel, kind of like we see on social media, where people will talk about the most amazing experiences. And they really are amazing when they happen. But at the same time, I would say the average person going through this treatment, it might not be as quite pronounced necessarily. And so I think kind of encouraging us to look at things a little bit differently, kind of chew on it. It's almost like I want you to hold something, kind of turn it over in your hand and see it from different perspectives. Because when we do that, we might find something nestled in one side of it that we didn't notice in the first go around. Cool. Let's get moving on. The next kind of lens that I find to be really helpful is quite the opposite, actually, of the last one. The last one was really kind of diving into the specific chapters and moments of your experience and kind of seeing it from a different perspective. This romance movie lens, as I call it, it's kind of the exact opposite of that. Instead of zooming in, let's zoom out. The reason why it's called a romance movie lens is because romance movies oftentimes will follow a pretty familiar storyline. Typically, you got two characters that have a relationship, they have a falling apart, they get back together, and they live happily ever after in the end of the movie. And if you were to watch any random 15 minutes of the movie, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. It's going to seem pretty disjointed and out of place. But if you watch the entire thing, by becoming attached to the characters, kind of seeing their journey, the peaks and valleys, it usually leaves with a pretty unique and heartfelt feeling at the end of the movie. And in the same way, I think it's interesting to explore how, instead of getting caught up in the individual chapters that come up during your infusion experience, let's zoom out. What feeling did the treatment leave you with? By process of going through these ups and downs and anything in between, uh, what left us? What was the last resulting feeling that came from this whole experience? And is there value and is there insight into that feeling? Maybe it's a very unique feeling that we haven't felt before. Maybe it's one that we have felt before, but it's been a long time. And noticing the path that it took to get to that feeling can also provide a lot of insight for us as we move forward. William Richards, a classic psychedelic researcher, he talks a lot about, and I love his language. He talks about how the brain can create, he calls it choreographing, psychodynamic or atypical dramas, psychodramas sometimes as he talks about it, which I think is a really interesting way to think about it. Your brain is creating this experience for you during the infusion. Why do you think it's creating this one as opposed to any other one? And what can we learn from that? And the last lens I'll share with us today, this is actually taken directly from Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, kind of a classic book on psychedelics and their role in mental health and healing. He said in his book, compared to other drugs, psychedelics seldom affect people the same way twice, because they tend to magnify what's already going on both inside and outside of one's heads. And that magnifying part is exactly where the name magnifying glass comes from in this lens. that typically psychedelics, particularly ketamine infusions, can bring up things going on in our life. They can really give us a unique insight. Kind of like if you had a window into your unconscious and you could just watch it for a moment. These infusions can allow us to get that kind of reflection and observation of things that might not always be at the fore of our mind. I always think it's important to explore and consider, well, what didn't come up in this infusion that maybe you thought might have come up? Was there a reaction to emotional topics that was similar or different to how you might experience it day to day? And what kind of memories came up? We'll talk about when we worked together at the clinic, the value of intention setting. And that's kind of a whole other component that we won't really go into as much today. But with that intention, it's interesting to observe and notice what comes up for us during our treatment. And this can be a valuable lens to reflect on and start to integrate our experiences from.
That's something as you say that, Trevor, and I look at the slide here, that was something that was very helpful when I went through my series is actually working with you and extracting more out of what those sessions were and what they meant. And then when you get a few of these going, okay, what is the correlation between your takeaways from your first, second, third, fourth infusion?
Yes. I sometimes make the lighthearted joke when I start working with patients that statistically it's more than likely than not you're going to get positive outcomes. But the one thing I can say with 100% certainty is you're going to learn something new about yourself throughout this process.
Yes.
And that is something that I think, especially considering this magnifying glass lens, kind of allows us to learn new things about ourselves. What comes up, what doesn't, what's our reaction to it in a different state of mind. All of this bits of information is incredibly valuable in the long run. But let's go on for a second. We can kind of talk about the second half of all of this. How do we sustain results? Maybe we have fantastic, like I said, statistically, it's likely you will, but how do we make sure it sticks? Because I think that's one of the biggest concerns when it comes to ketamine infusions, is that there are some places around the United States that really rely on people coming back forever, in theory. That's not our goal. Our goal is to cause positive change so that people can live the life they want to live and get out there and do the things with the ones that matter most to you. My goal is eventually to fire all of my clients because you're doing so well that you don't need me. And that's kind of my angle on all of this. So this next section is really diving into how do we ensure that happens and sticks around. I always like to kind of bring in research when it comes to conversations like this. So I think the first thing I can mention is that when it comes to looking at literature and research on ketamine infusions and what sustains results, the number one thing, strongest determinant of sustained treatment outcomes is ongoing psychotherapy. That is the one thing that I can point to confidently with research that has been the one proven factor. I really like to kind of involve this one. This is a 2021 study that came out of Yale University. They can kind of see on the left-hand side, this gray area. That's what's happening during the infusion series. And everything to the right of it in the white, that's all kind of what happens afterward. And they basically have two groups, the blue one being what's called a control. There's no therapy going on. It's just ketamine infusions and then out to the world. The other one, the kind of the orange or gold colored line there, that's the same thing for the first ketamine infusion, but the difference is afterward, they're involved with a therapist doing cognitive behavioral therapy for the next few weeks. And you can kind of see in the first part, relatively similar decline in symptoms. So a higher score is going to be more depression symptoms and a lower score is less depression symptoms. And over the first 8 weeks, although the control group, the no therapy group is a little bit worse off, they're fairly comparable. There's not a radically large amount of difference between the two. But the fascinating part here for me is what happens after 8 weeks. Because after 8 weeks, we notice the group splitting. Those without therapy, their symptoms start to kind of creep back in. They're ending lower than where they started, but still only about as good as they were halfway through the treatment series. In contrast, those with ongoing therapy, we can see that line pretty consistently decline, meaning that they're getting less and less depression symptoms over time. And at the 17-week mark, 17, I guess that would be 14 weeks after the infusion series is done, those that were in therapy, doing cognitive behavioral therapy in the study, are radically lower. Even with the standard degree of deviation, it is far lower than the group that did not. There's a lot of data. I'm not expecting it necessarily to make sense to everybody, but the reason why I bring it up is because it's a clear sign, and this is kind of a research-backed support of why therapy is important after doing a ketamine series. So we can see in a large study like this that it does have a really positive effect for individuals. To complement the research, I think it might be valuable for me to share a little bit about my own clinical experience. At this point in time, I've been working in the field now for, like I said, about 4 years. I've worked with just over 350 patients at this point. And the number one thing I can tell every single person I work with is that if nothing changes during your treatment series, nothing changes. And it's not rocket science here, it's pretty straightforward. But what I mean by that is that if you go through this treatment series, we start feeling better, we're noticing improvements, but nothing about our patterns in life, nothing about the way we approach life, nothing about anything we have control over changes. We're just maintaining as usual. I fundamentally believe that people aren't depressed or anxious or traumatized for no reason. Usually there's some pretty dang good reasons why we feel the way we are, whether it's specific events, whether it's societal or cultural or kind of environmental factors, whether it's stressors like work or family. But I think part of the process and why I'm involved in these ketamine infusion treatments is to explore how can we make life look different in the future than how it does today. I don't necessarily want to try to get back on track because that track led to exactly where we are right now. Instead, let's try to get on an adjacent track, one that's similar in some ways, but also different in others, so that we can find a different outcome and not end up in the same situation we were when we first came in for treatment in the beginning. To actually define what it means to change our future, I think it's important to consider like three main categories. How are our thoughts going to be different in the future than when we first started? Maybe this means noticing unhelpful thinking patterns. Maybe this means challenging them. Maybe it means even adopting new perspectives or way of approaching life if we can't actually change the exact thing that's going on around us. Of course, behaviors are important too. How can we make life look different than it in the beginning? Maybe that means I'm going to go for a walk a couple times a week. Maybe that means I'm exercising more. Maybe that's diet related. Maybe this is simply just spending time connecting to those around us that matter most. And more of an abstract, but still really important way of changing the future is to identify and align with our core values. What do we stand for? That's how I generally approach patients in my work of therapy is I'm never going to tell somebody what's right or wrong. I'm going to ask what seems right and wrong to you and how do we align with that? If I want to show up as genuine in every kind of situation I enter in, all of a sudden I have a compass to navigate even the wildest of environments and the wildest of situations or challenges. And so I think part of this is identifying what are our values and how do we move forward with alignment of those. Lastly, I think we should spend a few moments talking about booster infusions. This is obviously a key feature, something that can be really helpful. I know I've been mentioning before that we don't want you to come back. We want you to live your life and go out and do the things that you want to do. However, booster infusions are incredibly helpful for a large number of people. Some people actually find a lot of benefit using ketamine booster infusions in place of medications. Can't say it works for every single person, but I think it's definitely a solid option. Oftentimes, other medications can come with complex side effects, whereas ketamine infusions, relatively, for the general person, have far fewer. But some of the things to consider, and this is data that came from previous work, so not NeuroGlow. I want to be clear about that. This is coming from my work back in Washington State. I noticed that about 1/3, about 33% of people who completed their ketamine infusion series are likely to come back for an infusion. And that really is only tracking about 6 months out. So I just got to be clear, this could be different. Maybe somebody comes back 12 months down the road. It's also possible that people moved away. They're doing so well, they don't need to come back. It's possible that they can no longer afford treatment. There's a lot of factors the data doesn't show. But generally speaking, about 1/3 of people were coming back for treatments. And the amount of time they would wait to return for these is about 2 to 3 months. We would notice that about 2 to 3 months after finishing their infusion series, if they were going to come back, that's probably when they would, most common. Which kind of leads very naturally into when should I consider getting a booster infusion for myself? When would it be right? And there's kind of two lines of thought that are pretty similar to each other, but I'll share both of them. The first one is what I would recommend for most people, honestly. I would say, make the appointment, get a safety net in place for yourself. Maybe book something a month, 2 months, perhaps 3 months after your infusion series completes. Get that on the books. That'll be your safety net. Heaven forbid symptoms start returning, life gets harder, there's an unexpected life event, whatever it may be. Having that safety net can allow you to course correct before things get too difficult and too complex for yourself. I always say you can cancel your appointment. If you're doing so well you don't need it, I would love for you to cancel it. I would love for you to go out and spend that time and money with your family. The other option is more of a long-term lens, and that's that if you notice symptoms starting to return, let's say that maybe I came in and it was at 8 out of 10 severity. When I left, it was a 4 out of 10. If I'm starting to feel like, oh, I'm about like out of 6, like I'm not as bad as when I started, but I can feel it coming back and I'm a little worried it might get worse, that's the time to book your booster infusion. I always say it's a good idea to reach out sooner than later. You never know how busy the clinic is. Better to get an appointment at the time that you want, the day that you want, that works with your schedule and your life. And that'll be really helpful. We're always kind of in our back pocket. And a lot of people might even have noticed in their own initial series that after 1 or 2 treatments, they were feeling noticeably different and noticeably better, especially if that was you. This is the time to consider coming back for an infusion if symptoms start coming back.
That was so well put, Trevor. I
Right.
would have has it been your experience? Have you seen that after a patient goes through a series, maybe they've done 6 infusions, sometimes I feel like maybe patients coming into this may not have the awareness of how bad it was, right? And then they have this
Yeah.
measurably improved. So after you've completed the series, you have like this new baseline of kind of where you're at, paired with some more self-awareness around it. So you kind of innately have a little bit more ability to kind of gauge, that overall kind of where you're at.
That's spot on. And I think another idea that's similar to that is that as a therapist, I've noticed there's so much energy and time spent into, I call it below the line challenges, kind of just getting to a level of okay. I'm not even asking for good. I'm just asking to not be suffering. And there's a lot of energy spent on that, like a deep breathing, mindfulness, coping skills, all of these things. But the thing is, nobody wakes up in the morning being excited to deep breathe all day. Nobody wants to wake up and be excited to cope. We hopefully want to have something more than that, something to really shoot for in life that makes us happy and satisfied and excited to get out of bed in the morning. And I think, especially if we're talking about long term and booster infusions, we can even shoot higher than just eliminating the negative. We can start incorporating how do we add in the positive. I think that's something that in the long term, booster infusions can be a useful tool for that kind of thing too. Of how do I dive into my unconscious and what really matters? What's going to drive me? What's going to make me excited about life? And we can approach those things too. It's not all about just eliminating the negative. Wellness is not defined by the bad, it's often defined by the good. And so that's kind of something that we can really dive into ourselves too, both with ketamine infusions and ongoing therapy, which kind of brings into kind of the whole review of everything, sustained treatment results and how do we make sure that it keeps going. The things that I talked about today were psychotherapy. That is the research-backed #1 most important thing. The other things are how do we change our thoughts and behaviors? We can change those in ways that are in alignment with our values. And then we talk about booster infusions. All of these factors together can ensure that we have sustainable long-term results that result in our life being better than when it came in. That's the end goal of all of this. But
Yes.
that kind of
Yeah, I
brings
mean
me to
that's
the end.
that
Definitely want to open it up and everything else, but I appreciate everybody for listening out there.
Yes. Thank you so much, Trevor. While we as we wrap
Of
up here,
course.
this is Trevor's information, ladies and gentlemen. If you if you want to further that work and get some time with Trevor, do reach out, get on his calendar, continue those integration sessions. He has been excellent to work with, and we just get so much great feedback from our patients that work with him. And so, you know, um, you had mentioned something a moment ago, just about it's not just getting you back to this baseline. You know, I came into NeuroGlow in May on the leadership side of the team here, and just in the few months that I've been here, some of the stories that our team will tell us about people, and it goes back to part of our mission statement, which is getting people back that enthusiasm for life, getting that zest for life back, getting back to the things that they like. We had a really compelling story just this weekend. We had a patient reach out that was an artist, incredible artist, and had not done any artwork for some amount of time. And in going through these infusion series and really working on themselves, they've gotten to where they've got that zest for life back. They're painting again, they're creating, and that was really cool. That was really cool to hear. And I have experienced that personally in going through infusions and then getting back to some better, walking daily. Some of the things that you were talking about, just getting back to a better quality of life than I ever had before that. And so, something I'm personally very passionate about, something that if you speak with any one of our RNs or NPs or anyone here at NeuroGlow, we are all very passionate about helping people heal and take them on this journey through this. And Trevor's a big part of that. And so, yeah, that's all we have for today. I do not see any additional Q&A here. I will ask you one question though,
Yeah.
Trevor, outside of additional integration,
Mhm.
when that graph that you showed at the beginning was really interesting, showing after the 8 weeks, and then the sample group outside
Mhm.
of integration sessions with you. Do you have any other, if somebody is bought in and really wants to continue on this journey, what are two or three other very tactical things that they should really consider? I know we talked about nutrition yesterday with Paula on our session. It was incredibly insightful just because of the correlation there. But what are some other kind of tactical things that you may, approach for a patient that wants to continue on in that growth?
So I may have a little bit of an atypical answer to that question.
Yeah.
I I think if we like just unpack like what is therapy, like what is ongoing therapy after your treatment, essentially what that is it's really only an hour of your week typically, and it's time spent reflecting and honestly looking at our lives. There's a degree of accountability. There's a degree of vulnerability as far as talking about difficult things going through our lives. There's a degree of kind of planning and problem solving of how we can approach the upcoming week in a slightly different way, maybe more in alignment with what we want. And yes, that all happens with a therapist. But hopefully it's not the only place it's happening too. That's part of my work with patients as well is I want to work myself out of a job. I want you to get this degree of support and insight that you get from myself in our therapy calls with those around you. In a perfect world, my job should not exist. It's not a perfect world, so that's why I'm here. But I think part of this is how can we keep this alive with those around us? Maybe that's a check-in with a family member or a loved one once a week. Maybe this is spending a few moments journaling. Maybe this is going for a walk and just thinking about the events going on in the day and what we want to do when we get home. All of these little things can have components of what's happening in a therapy session. I think that it's not even therapy is used as a variable in this study and in others as well, because it's really helpful. Like it's a time that can be well defined. We kind of know what to expect when it comes to therapy, especially in cognitive behavioral therapy, like they're talking about in this study. But there are so many factors of therapy that can take place outside of the therapy room, that can take place in real life. And that's kind of what I would want to shoot for with all my patients. It's like, how can we start getting those needs met, that reflection time, that planning for the future, all of these things? How can we get that to happen external to therapy so that that'll naturally keep us going? The only downsides of that is you have deeper relationships and you're not paying for therapy. So it's a pretty good outcome in either case. That's kind of how some of the ways we could do it, is to kind of keep that alive outside.
Yeah, that was excellent, man.
Awesome.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Trevor, for joining us. I want to thank our Thrive members for being part of this program, continuing on this wellness journey with us. We're excited to have you as part of this program, and we will obviously send out the recording of this to our members here later today, and be on the lookout for sign up for our session in September, where Trevor will be taking us on another really insightful journey in this space. So, Trevor, thank you so much, and please, if y'all have any questions, if you'd like to reach out to work with Trevor, hit him up there. His email is trevor@psychthera.org. And that is it for today. Trevor, I want to thank you. I want to thank our
Awesome.
audience. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And we will see you guys next month. Take care.